Good evening. My name is Tom Maloney. I'm the chair of the Department of Economics and the director of the Barbara L. and Norman C. Tanner Center for Nonviolent Human Rights Advocacy at the University of Utah. And it's my privilege to welcome you to our 7th annual conference on human rights, conflict resolution, nonviolence, and peace. This year's conference examines religion, conflict, and peacemaking. We begin planning these conferences usually about a year ahead of time, and when we start to plan, there's often a tension between wanting to address very timely and current matters on the one hand, and wanting to be sure that the issues that we choose for our conference will still be relevant a year later when the conference is to be held. Ultimately, I suppose that was never much of a concern as we began planning this year's conference. The entanglement of religion with social conflict presents a perennial, sadly reliable challenge. In our planning, though, I think we've placed considerable emphasis on not simply documenting, again, the apparent connections between religion and conflict, but rather we want to be sure to highlight methods of moving towards solutions to such conflicts, as well as cases in which religious values and religious communities play an active and important role in resolving these conflicts. We'll examine both these perennial conflicts and potential sources of their resolution, or at least their amelioration. In our panels tomorrow at the Officers Club at the University of Utah, we'll begin at 8 o'clock in the morning. The conference is free and open to the public, and we welcome wide participation. We'll be going from about 8 o'clock till about 4 in the afternoon, so I hope to see many of you there. Our ability to engage in this work is a direct result of the generosity of the Tanner family, Barbara and Norman and Deb Sawyer, and I want to thank them again for their vision in establishing the center and their extraordinarily generous ongoing support. Please join me in thanking them. Each conference is organized by a distinct team of University of Utah faculty who develop the theme and invite the speakers and organize the program. And I want to thank this year's team for their outstanding work. Muriel Schmidt, the director of the Religious Studies program at the University of Utah, who is the committee chair, and her fellow committee members, Cecilia Wainrib of the Department of Psychology, Nathan Paul DeVere of the Department of Languages and Literature, and David Derizotis of the College of Social Work. And then beyond the core faculty team, a number of departments and centers at the university, as well as other local organizations, help make the conference possible through a variety of kinds of support, financial and otherwise. And this year's conference has benefited from the generosity of our partners, the College of Social and Behavioral Science, the S.J. Quinney College of Law, the College of Humanities, the Tanner Humanities Center, the Office of the Vice President for Academic Affairs, the Office of the Vice President for Institutional Advancement, and the Office of the Vice President for Student Affairs, all at the University of Utah. The Salt Lake City Public Library, of course, as well as the College of Religious Education at Brigham Young University. And I also want to thank our co-sponsors and funders, the Departments of Economics, Languages and Literature, Psychology, the Honors College, the International Center, the International Studies Program, the Peace and Conflict Studies Program, and the D Endowment, all at the University of Utah, as well as the Utah Humanities Council. So please join me in acknowledging our committee as well as our funders and sponsors. Thank you. And finally, I want to thank the staff of the center, Alita Tu, Victoria Medina, and Marianne Carpenter, who are here as well. So note that there will be a public reception in the atrium after tonight's lecture. We'll have more information about the conference tomorrow, as well as other upcoming Tanner Human Rights Center programming, which includes Pathways to Peace, which is a speaker series that we've organized for the last couple of weeks of March and the first couple of weeks of April, organized in collaboration with the library and a large number of other local organizations. So we'll have that information for you afterward. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Muriel Schmidt, Director of the Religious Studies program at the University of Utah, who will introduce tonight's opening keynote speaker. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Over the past 3.5 years for my research and for my teaching, I have been reading many books and articles about the conflict in Israel-Palestine, grassroots peacebuilding movements, and the role of interfaith dialogue in peace processes. And the name of Professor Mohammed Abu-Nimer comes up constantly, I can tell you. So it's really, really my pleasure to welcome him tonight for the opening of this conference at the University of Utah. His name comes up so often that it's actually difficult to summarize his contribution to the conversation that surrounds the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as well as his role in highlighting the importance of interfaith dialogue in the region. More generally, Professor Abu-Nimer has become a central voice in the theoretical and practical discussion about the role of religion and interfaith dialogue in peacemaking, and he has written extensively on the subject. So I won't list all his bibliography. It's a lot of books that he co-edited, contributed to, many articles, scholarly articles that he wrote on the topic. Most recently, one of his volumes is Unity in Diversity, Interfaith Dialogue in the Middle East. Another one is on nonviolence and peacebuilding in Islam. And he also edited a volume called Reconciliation, Justice, and Coexistence. All very interesting contribution to our discussion. Professor Abu-Nimer received his BA and MA from Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and a PhD in conflict analysis and resolution from George Mason University. He is currently the professor in the International Peace and Conflict Resolution Program at the School of International Service at the American University in Washington, D.C., where he also directs the Peacebuilding and Development Institute. Aside from Palestine-Israel, Professor Abu-Nimer has intervened and led conflict resolution training workshops in Northern Ireland, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, as well as the United States, and he just told me beforehand, also in Chad and Burkina Faso, and even in Switzerland, my native country, so we need it too. So we are very fortunate to have him here tonight to open our conference, and I'm very pleased to welcome him on this stage to listen to his address entitled Religion and Peace in Israel-Palestine, Does It Need a Miracle? So I hope we'll have an answer, or partial. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Good evening. Thank you for the very warm introduction and definitely generous notes there. I am honored to be here. I'm also excited about coming here for the first time and enjoying the snow and the scene. I'm very grateful for the invitation from the Tanner Center and also from the about 19 or 18 different co-sponsors and partners. Certainly feel honored and appreciate the opportunity to give a keynote on such an important as well as dear subject to my heart as you listen from the introduction here. With the time that I think I have here, what I'd like to do is try to answer. I'm not sure if I have a full answer for this question, but at least I have speculation. Maybe toward the end I can share with you some of those speculations about it. But first of all, I come to this field from practice into academic, and then I found out after 8 or 9 years of practice that I need to write, and I hated writing. And I actually fought with every evaluator and American, particularly, or European expert who came to Israel-Palestine between 81 and 1990, tried to convince us to write or even evaluate what we were doing, and we refused. And then ironically, I found myself exactly in that shoes when I go to Sri Lanka or to Mindanao or to many other places. As a practitioner, it's very hard for you to sit down and reflect and ask the question, am I doing the right thing? Am I doing the activity that are effective? Is this whole thing worth investing in it? And probably because you're afraid to discover that it needs a miracle in order to see some tangible results, definitely in the case of Israel-Palestine. What I'm hoping to do again as a practitioner more is really to reflect on a piece of research that I did in Israel-Palestine, Jordan, Egypt, and Lebanon, where I've interviewed with a colleague of mine about 50 religious peacemakers in each of those countries, asking them about questions of effective work, obstacles, model that they have. And I've summarized them in the first and the second point, which I'm hoping to cover today. And the third one is really trying to take those models and go to a case study. And the case study that I thought would be helpful, not helpful, maybe a bit depressing, the Gaza war. And basically asking the question, is this religious peacemaking can be sustained during a war like Gaza? And Gaza war, because this was the last round, the last official round between Israeli and Palestinians in terms of cycles of violence, so it might be helpful to look at it. So bear with me through this conversation, and this is done for the advocacy and human rights perspective, not necessarily from a full conflict resolution or dialogical approach, just to fit the context. There is no doubt that religion causes war, or religious interpretation causes war. There is no doubt about that. Everybody can be expert on it. In fact, many people who argue for separating religion from the society or from politics, they try to say religion has been manipulated as a source of conflict and a tool to provoke violence, and the politicians mobilize people through it, and religion is an ideology that justify exclusion and discrimination. So this is, I think, everybody expert on that, and you don't need to be Muslim or a Christian or a Jew. Buddhists also do that, Hindus do that. Every religion, every faith group have done these things effectively and to some extent for a long period of time. And the Israeli-Palestinian did not invent this. This has really have been invented, depending on the story that you believe in it. You could go to the Old Testament or the New Testament or the Holy Quran, or you could go to the Buddhist teaching. You can go back as 2,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 years, you still find example of people fighting because of their lack of tolerance of religious identity. I'm not going to spend much time on this because I think you just need to listen to some of the news these days and you can find lots of examples. So the argument here that religion, religious identity, and religious tools in the sense of the scripture, the rituals, the institution of religion, the clergy themselves, these components of any faith group, any religion, can contribute to peace. And this should not be a surprise to us because, like my colleague John MacDonald and Louise Diamond, who put this chart out, were trying to convince politicians in Washington and other areas, look, everybody has a shot at peace building, not only the track one government, but they came up at least with 9 tracks here with media in the middle. So if business have a job in building peace, if researchers have that job as well, educators, individuals, activists, advocates, and the human rights, definitely religious individual and religious institution should step to the plate or should step in to contribute to peace building. However, it's still debated, not only by the activists, it's also still debated by politicians and by different donors and international organizations who are very hesitant about involving religious individual into any peace process. Unfortunately, but I think the the grounds have shifted in the last maybe 20 years, and you can find both the US government agencies, British, definitely Norwegian and Swedish, and the Canadian, those are major donors in the international development scene, beginning to examine the 101 religious peace building, even arguing to train their staff in how can we engage with those strange, weird, faith-based organizations in conflict area. Strange and weird because they don't speak the same language of faith with them. They usually speak the language of secular, humanist, liberal or conservative, doesn't matter, but they come in with the secular assumption that religion has nothing to do with peace building, and it only has to do with war. As we all know, there is no sort of why religion. The argument has been very simple. The argument that religious identity, not like cultural identity or soccer, football fan identity or any other, those are strong, but religious identity somehow trigger a deeper set of feelings, and when you manage to tap into them, amazing energy can be cultivated for good and constructive engagement, but also for bad and destructive attacks on the other. It depends how you channel that mobilization of the religious identity. But it's definitely very strong, very deep sense of feeling and identity that I think stand behind that. It's also built in many cases on fear and pride. Fear from the punishment and or sanctions by your faith, and also it built on rewards if you are a good, faithful person. So there's a strong motivation there to be manipulated as well. In the recent Egyptian election, one of the election ads were running, if you want to go to Jannah, to heaven, vote to this person. So now one person vote can actually guarantee you, seat in heaven. The more amazing that a person actually has the key for that. So he can tell you if you're going to heaven or not. So you can really be very creative in dealing with those fears and sense of pride. All religion have sources of justice, forgiveness, patience, peacemaking, resistance, and mercy. These are not only Christian, and they're not also only Jewish or Buddhist. Every religion actually do them. I used to do this exercise with the religious groups. In my training, I asked one group I asked both of them. The first question, can you be separate in different rooms and write down what are the values of peace that you have in your faith? And they would love that task usually, because they get to praise and present the positive things of their faith. And I'll give them half an hour. They'll come back with 5-6 charts, and I say no names, just write the values and the examples, only values and norms that you have. And then I put about 20 charts or 15 charts on the board, and I asked somebody to come from outside, ask them, can you tell which is Catholic, which is Muslim, which is Protestant, and most of the answer usually no. The values are mixed and very similar. But their pain is usually when I send them to the same room and I say, can you please write down the ways in which your faith cause violence, exclusion, and discrimination. And you could see them how painful for them to go to the next room. Why do we need to do this? If we say it, maybe they will use it against us. Or this is haram, or shame, or forbidden. You can't really do that. Anyway, when they come back, they usually, instead of 5-6 charts, they come back with half charts, with about 4 or 5 things, and they're sort of ashamed of presenting it. So again, we trained in order to praise and look for the constructive and the good and the positive, and we're trained not to share the critical aspect, the critical reading of our text as well as our tradition in that sense. There is no doubt that religious people can have lots of roles in any given conflict, and you can see that this is a list developed with Cynthia Sampson, my colleague who used to teach in the Eastern Mennonite program as well at American University. And I can give example for each one of them, those in terms of advocacy or observation, presence, accompaniment, Again, you can find many Witness to Truth. The CPT group in Hebron have been doing that since 1994, doing number of these action. In South African Church have practiced many of those. There is worldwide, there is thousands of examples of religious peacemaking. This is a group we work with in Egypt, Coptic and Muslim imams and priests. And they were in Alexandria recently discussing what type of activity they should be making in order to deal with the change and that taking place in Egypt as well. A Buddhist monk who decided that walking in Palestine and protesting by annoying the soldiers and everybody with his stick and sounds as a way to express solidarity. And he came as an individual. He didn't need a group, didn't need an organization. He just came in to do that there. A Buddhist monk and a Catholic priest who put such a powerful partnership in Sri Lanka. We work with them, and they created Interreligious Foundation for Peace. And they actually refused to receive money from donors for 2 years. It was amazing because the donors kept telling them, please take money to do your activity. And they said no, until the tsunami took place. And then they had to take some funds, and that's when their problems actually started organizationally. Before, they were more of a social movement. And they both were blacklisted from their communities, and they almost lost their life because of the religious establishment. The Buddhist as well as the Christian there, but mostly the Buddhist here, were really upset that somebody like this priest or monk would stand against, fully confront the government in a nonviolent resistance and a confrontational manner. If we move to the Middle East, it's amazing when you look at Oslo, Camp David 1 and 2 on the roadmap, and Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. But if we only look at the Israel-Palestine cases, it's interesting that you find here agreements that carried out by secular politicians trying to decide the fate of Jerusalem without consulting or engaging religious peacemaker or religious peace actors, and they expect the religious community to accept their resolution or their proposed options for solving this conflict. How can you solve the Jerusalem conflict or the Holy Land conflict without engaging people of faith from the three groups? Who came up with this idea that a group of secularists can come, sit down in Geneva or any other place, and then master some kind of an agreement and come back and convince their religious leader, here, you need to go and market this? That's something strange. We committed the same mistake in Iraq. When we invaded Iraq, it took us a while to understand that we need to really deal with the religious leaders. Not only tribal leader, but religious leader. And in Afghanistan, we're still struggling. Should we negotiate with the religious leader of Taliban? Do you negotiate with the Taliban? Because they're motivated by faith. Do you engage with these groups? And I guess Washington policymakers are still divided into that, but I think both in Afghanistan and the US realize that you do need to negotiate with them. So I've been arguing and articulating what can religious leaders do, what type of action they can have in a political peace process. They can have input in negotiation. In southern Philippine Mindanao, there were some grassroots religious groups who actually monitored and had input in the negotiation between the Moro, MILF, and the Catholic or Philippine government in producing an agreement there, and also in monitoring it. Advocate for right and justice, educate for peace, contribute to social, economic development, justice. This is only a very short list. There are many ways, many roles if we can engage the religious leader into any peace process. As I said, we'll go back to Israel-Palestine more specifically, and also Middle East in general, but specifically Israel-Palestine. When we talk to the religious leaders in those contexts or these areas, it was interesting what we discover. First of all, they're a very small group. They usually, we call them I was part of that as well at some point. It's the first most 100 famous people. If you come to Utah and you say, what would be? Who's the best skier? If this is the theme of the day, probably there is a most famous 100 people that you have to talk to them to talk about skiing in Utah or in Salt Lake City. In Jerusalem, if you go and ask who is doing religious peace building, there are about 50, 60 people who have been devoted out of faith, operating and moving this ship or moving this action along. Our study was basically to focus on them or mainly on them. What we propose here, two models that they have found or they deal with. I'm going to be critical of both of them, but mostly starting with the harmony model. And the harmony model of interfaith dialogue in Israel-Palestine particularly, but also in the Arab world it does, and in the US, and even in Switzerland. But it really doesn't have a place, a geography, but that's where we found this model. Model that where religious people come together, or people of faith come together, and they avoid talking about a conflict. And they avoid talking about politics. And they either focus on rituals, how many times do you pray, why do you pray this way, do you fast, what's the meaning of fasting in your faith, how could you be Jewish and Buddhist and Hindu and Muslim and a Christian in the same time, kind of individual spirituality approach you have. Mainly they focus on the similarities. And this contact program or interfaith dialogue can go sometimes for 6, 7 years or, number of years. It's not only one meeting. It's many meetings where they explore the similarities. It's a very good model for beginners who have such a high level of fears from the other. It becomes problematic when a Coptic Christian or a Muslim in Egypt engage in such conversation for 2-3 years without talking about the problems that faces one group or faces them in terms of their religious identity. It becomes problematic when you're a Palestinian, and in order for you to get to the interfaith dialogue group, you have to go through about 5 or 6 checkpoints. And then when you get to the room itself, you find Israeli Jewish participants who will say in the beginning, let's not talk about the occupation. Let's not talk about politics. Basically, don't tell me about the 6 checkpoints that you went through them. Let's talk about our similarities, our connection. I think it's a very good model, again, for building initial relationship. But it becomes problematic when the participants stop exploring beyond these differences, beyond these similarities, out of fear mostly. And I have plenty of those examples. It's not Israel-Palestine, it's here. It's like having American black and white sitting in a room exploring race relation and not talking about slavery, and not talking about segregation period, and not talking about any of the profiling issues that facing African American. It's very similar, and I've also seen some of these groups actually in that mode. The liberation model is a model really where the group do not necessarily focus on similarities. They focus mainly on politics. They do advocacy, action. They look at how can they confront an apartheid system. How can they confront an occupation system? How they can confront, again, slavery or a social problem that they have. Their emphasis is not exploring the individual. The first one, the harmony model, they come to the dialogue group, the majority particularly, because it's safe to meet the minority there. It's not safe outside. But this is for 3 days, I can come and look at them from the window. And it's safe. And I can study them. I can learn, not out of evil or conspiracy, no, out of genuine interest in the other. But because of my fears, I don't like to venture too much into the politics or the confrontation. So I like to talk about hummus and falafel, or about za'atar and Lebanese, or a music, or a film. These are very important things in the beginning. But if you keep eating hummus and falafel for 2-3 years in the same meeting, you're not really going beyond that. If you compare it to the other model, we'll find they also lack the food. They focus too much on shouting against the system. And they neglect building relationship among them as individuals. The liberation model is a model that looks at differences. It's fixed into articulating why a government why the policy in Egypt, for example, have prohibited building churches for Christian Copts for many years. They will take that subject and focus on it for a number of meetings and try to find ways to respond to it, versus focusing on the harmony and relationship building. We found those two models there, and what we found really in most of the cases that they don't coexist as much. The type of people who go to the harmony model are certain profile, certain personality, and the type of people who go and sit in front of the bulldozer are different. But sometimes you can graduate, move from one to the other with certain facilitation and intervention, but those two models do exist. This is from the 2005 Palestinian Santa Claus calling for autonomy. Liberation theology dialogue through action, that's I think the second one. The liberation model kind of push the participants to get out of their comfort zone. You see, if you come to talk to me about Muslim in America, and you want to talk about how do I live as a Muslim in the US, what do Muslims in the US do during Ramadan, the conversation would be very pleasant. There will be no problem with that. You don't need to get out of your comfort zone in that conversation. And also I don't need to, because I know how to tell the story. But the moment I begin talking about profiling Muslims in airports, or the moment I began thinking about 15, 20 institutions in the US were put under strict surveillance by the security, then you have to feel a little bit uncomfortable, especially if you take responsibility on policy of government. So that model pushed people out of their comfort zone. You cannot continue to be comfortable in this liberation model. It's really an instrument for concrete action for faith as well. Tamimi on the left side, and also Zughbi, I think a couple of you, I talked to them, Am Center, and also the Archbishop here. The three of them came on a panel 4 in nonviolence resistance in Bethlehem, trying to assert their religious identity to resist the occupation. And what they do, we went in a nonviolence, again, sit in the checkpoint, and it's sort of a challenge the entrance to Jerusalem. Several of them never been able to go into Jerusalem, particularly Zughbi and Awad, Bshara Awad, who basically about 15 minutes away from Jerusalem, but for years could not go in. So they used their religious identity in order to establish a message of confrontation. Children also involved in nonviolence resistance and advocacy, and if the children could do this and conduct their class on the checkpoint, definitely religious clergy, Palestinians and Israelis, can engage in such activity. But somehow, very few of them choose to do this model. The majority of them choose the model of harmony, particularly on the Israeli side. But the model of resisting, confronting, because you could be a clergy and conduct your rituals Friday, Saturday, or Sunday on the checkpoint. When you choose to do it in the church or the synagogue and live in denial of not confronting the occupation or the reality inside Israel, you're making a decision. That was the model in terms of process. You either feel comfortable or out of your comfort zone. Another aspect of the content, what do they talk about? When they come together for 3 days, 4 days of interfaith dialogue, what are the content, the issues that they deal with? So there is this theological model, and it's the easy one, it's the classic, the traditional. You get together, you bring together rabbis and the priest and the imam, and they go and talk about religion. Not necessarily, this is recorded, so I should not be more critical. But I'll say, not necessarily they know their theology, but they will speculate about their own perception of their theology. So this meeting is for theologians. They talk about similarities and differences, about God, Holy Spirit, Mary, about jihad, about martyrdom. The status of women is one of the favorite subjects when you meet with Muslims. The status of women in the Quran, clergy, religious scholars are really people who deal with that. The problem, many times people go to interfaith dialogue and they go as observer and allow the clergy to tell them and to lecture to them, and when they leave they say we were in interfaith dialogue. And we discover that in Mindanao, Philippines, in the US, and also in many other places, there is another model of dialogue where people are more engaged, which is what the Mindanaoan called it dialogue of life, where you talk about specific problems that emerge out of your religious identity. It's not about theology. It's about the fact that if you're a Muslim and you're going into the airport in Manila and you look to the left or to the right, you can't see the prayer room. But you see about 50, or that's exaggeration, maybe 10 statues of Mary and a church. So to ask about structural discrimination for a minority, you have to deal with the dialogue of life. I can give you also many examples about Israel-Palestine, where you have to deal with issues of attacks on the mosques, attacks on the churches, on the holy spaces for the Muslim and for the Christian. You talk about your identity as a Muslim. If you're in Jerusalem, where to bury your dead. You talk about yourself as a Christian, about your capacity to travel from one place in Bethlehem to Jerusalem. These are daily life problems that they stem from the fact that you belong to certain faith. That conversation is dialogue of life. That's an interfaith dialogue that takes seriously the problems and the issues that have faced people in these groups. So you don't shun away from the discrimination and the prejudice. You still do grassroots celebration of rituals, learning more about each other's religion, but again, you ask yourself and the other, how do you live your religious identity? Is the structure, the town, the city, the state, the community where you live allow you to celebrate, express your identity? Or do you need to, like some of my students, to take the hijab or the headscarf in certain workplaces? Or if you international students, Muslim in DC, sometimes a couple of my students had a hard time finding a roommate. But it's because the expensive real estate, not because she was fully scarred, and also from South Asia. That conversation is dialogue of life. That one that affects the immediate life of people. It doesn't mean that the first model is not important, but it's limited in its capacity to reach people. So if we continue to introduce interfaith dialogue as religion and as theology, that vehicle for peace building will be limited and will only reach certain male, older male participants, whether Christian, Muslim, or Jews, or others. And this is an example of it. Basically, they added a woman here at the last minute, probably. But this is important also to add. But this is basically Christian, Muslim, Druze, and Jewish, 4 panelists talking about interfaith dialogue in one areas inside Israel as well. I'm critical of it because this is not interfaith dialogue. This is clergy telling people about their faith. And it's not really very different from the church service and others, because the same thing, they're protecting their zone and they're trying to defend their religious faith, and they're painting very positive image of it. I have also to repeat here again so I don't sound as too critical. I work and train in these groups, and I do feel connected to them, and I'm not belittling the work. I'm speaking out of partly sadness, partly compassion that this need to be done differently, not only in Israel-Palestine, but in other areas. We could look at 4 areas of this interfaith dialogue types in Israel-Palestine, and you can find the harmony model, all children of Abraham. I don't know about you, but in Washington we have about 4 or 5 houses of Abraham. Suddenly in the last 10 years, Abraham became having so many houses. Abraham tent, Abraham that, Abraham this. So the focus in Abraham is focus on similarities. It's good focus, but it's not going to go beyond that, because they go back and say Abraham is the common father for all of us, Christian, Muslim, and Jews, and we should go back and respect that and celebrate that commonality. You can get certain mileage out of that. But beyond it, it becomes problematic. It delves into the harmony model. You can talk about civic education, shared citizenship issue through dialogue of life as well. But again, the D1 is really where you hit some of the core issues that emanates or evolve from the religious identity. And I've talked about this. This is the liberation model with dialogue of life, the combination of those two. Some Muslim imams in southern Egypt as well. This is Milton Bennett model of intercultural sensitivity. I took it and developed interreligious sensitivity model, basically trying to measure when you take somebody in dialogue, interfaith journey, how far can you go with them? In the intercultural model, the model says you can become bicultural or multicultural, and that's supposedly the high end of the process of awareness and conscious. Can we imagine people becoming interreligious or multireligious, or people becoming bireligious? Many of the people I've worked with, in particular Israel-Palestine as well, they said, no, we're not about that. What we can aspire to is number 4, to accept the values and the rituals of the other. Accept their validity to exist. Number 5 is to experience them. So one priest I work with in Mindanao decided to shock everybody, and he declared he will fast the full month of Ramadan, 30 days. It was incredible effect on the participants, because he was willing to exercise a ritual from the other side in a way to send the message, I am giving you or working with you on the level of empathy. Many of people work in interfaith dialogue rarely get to that experience or the set of experiences or circle. Mostly we're talking about acceptance, the capacity to accept the other, accept the other to exist. And it might sound a little, but this is really a major accomplishment if you can do it in many conflict area, especially when there is no contact between the communities and people are burning mosques, burning churches. In Pakistan this week, there was a burning of a Shia mosque with 200 people killed because the number community who lived in that area could not tolerate the existence of this sect or this group. So tolerance is a huge accomplishment if it's achieved on an institutional level. Here's what we can accomplish. We can learn to understand each other's faith, because in most cases we're ignorant of each other's faith. We really know very, very, very little. And you could see that in many conflict area and also non-conflict area. People live in a conflict zone in a parallel path. They don't intersect. They coexist indeed, but they don't really know much about each other's faith. They know these are the Christian, these are the Muslim. They go to church on Sunday and we go to the mosque on Friday. And they fast on Ramadan and we fast on March or April. Beyond that, usually very little. The level of ignorance of the other faith is really high in many of the area. The second, we rehumanize, because many of the religious institutions are specialized in dehumanizing the other. They dehumanize the other through discourse and narrative well established. And this is not only Muslim or Christian or Jews. This is also many other faith groups dehumanize the enemy. So in the interfaith group, we basically move beyond the dehumanization. You discover that the other is exactly like you. In fact, that's my dissertation. I did about 175 interviews. I was evaluating some of these organizations. And what we had a question about, how was this meeting or dialogue group, and many of them say it was wonderful. And I said why it was wonderful, and the response usually will come because we enjoyed it. I said yes. What else? We had fun. I said okay. What else? And they'll say, you know what? We discover that they are exactly like us. So it took you 3 days, lots of falafel and hummus, and the music and the sport, in order to discover that the other is exactly like you, and the other is about 3 miles away from you. So what did you think the other is if he's not like you? He was subhuman? He was superhuman? That's what interfaith does, and in general dialogue, it really breaks those boundaries and walls that have been established in the conscious internally of the person. And you discover that they cry, they fear their victim, and they're also not so super subhuman, maybe a little. Because you're not going to get rid of all these feelings because of one interfaith dialogue community. Lots of obstacles that face these groups. Usually they are people who come to the interfaith dialogue group mostly have the religious-centric. They think their faith and believe their faith is the best. And they're just going to check the other out and convince them that they're wrong. That's how they start. Maybe they will go evolve in their conscious and awareness to accept the other, but their starting point in general, that my version of the truth is the central one. So we explain, we basically, many of it decide no political, I talked about that a little bit, leave the reality outside. So the dialogue interfaith become a tool to silence the minority in these cases. Because you ignore the street, you ignore the reality on the ground, and you want to talk about a message that's about 2,000 years old. You go back actually and argue about the relationship of the Prophet with the Jews or with the Christian. And you leave the neighborhood where you live. And if you want to talk about the neighborhood or the checkpoints or the occupation or the apartheid system, you are accused of non-dialogical. And that's a shaming term in these circles. A Catholic priest who was threatened with his life because he assisted Muslim refugees in North Sri Lanka during the war had to leave the town as well. Some people use interfaith dialogue as an excuse not to do action. So you go to the interfaith dialogue meetings number of times during the year or months, and then no need to go to demonstration, no need to be politically active against the system or the structure. And you said, I have done enough. That's not sort of, my energy is limited and I can't do anymore. Again, member of the dominant majority can afford the time and cost of the talk and understand. Interfaith dialogue, particularly the harmony one, majority of the groups focus on understanding the other. And it's good. But how long can you understand the other? I know a group that spent 9 years understanding the other, with no single action. And around them there is big fire. 3-4 wars took place. And there was no, because they said, we're still understanding the other. Who can afford that? Or basically the last one, the privileges of the psychologization of the conflict. That's again another problem in many of the dialogue groups. I'm going to focus on this one. Faith is not enough. Many of the dialogue groups basically, or leaders, focus on faith. I say, why you're doing this work? Because I have a calling out of my Christian or Jewish or Muslim identity. But as we discover from peace and conflict resolution, and in the age of professionalization, faith is not enough. It's good. But even if you're a very deep, faithful person and follow your faith, you still can make a big mistake as a facilitator. And it doesn't mean that you're a good listener. And it doesn't mean that you understand peace-building programming. So it's okay to receive some help in that area. Many of it really, sustainability and impact is problematic. and again, the avoidance of the occupation aspect. Majority groups usually initiate interfaith dialogue. So the Muslims in Egypt are pushing for interfaith dialogue as well. The Jewish organization in Israel-Palestine are the one mostly fundraising from the US and Europe, and mostly manage the programs, run the programs, and they have a partner who's a Muslim or a Christian, but they have really secondary role. And unfortunately, many of the organizations, that's how they operate. The language is a big barrier in that sense. Just a few minutes in the last 6 minutes here I have, look at Gaza. So if you take those models and those activists, here you're in the middle of your sort of interfaith dialogue, and you hit with the war in Gaza. And the war in Gaza, a few years ago, 3 years ago, it killed 1,400, over 5,000 were injured. Again, houses demolished. The entire Gaza was under really panic and traumatized situation. 4 Israeli citizens were killed, and about 30 soldiers as well killed. Tens of thousands of Israel were also panicked under the threat of a rocket attack. And basically, it's a war zone area. So the question I'm posing in this section, what do you do as a religious peacemaker in this context? Do you give up? Or do you become more creative and do more than harmony? Where do you take your ship? Where do you drive your car during this situation of the war? And again, you are in a reality of South Africa apartheid. Israel-Palestine today have many of the signs of South Africa apartheid, whether it is segregation, fencing, special streets for Israeli Jewish settlers and streets for the Palestinian, segregated school, checkpoints, and the whole system and the structure is very similar to the apartheid system in the 80s in South Africa. And Gaza was not really an exception. The exception with it was the level of use of illegal weapon. Because if you notice in Israel-Palestine, every round, and we have rounds, we have every 15 to 20 years one round. And those rounds of wars, every time we up the scale, the bar is raised of what is considered to be brutal. From the 80s till today, you will be amazed to see how the level of violence have been escalated, or the acceptance of level of violence have been really increased in that sense. There were attacks on mosques, there were a high number of children and women killed and injured, and massive destruction in Gaza. What was the response in the two communities? This is the same two communities that people argued there is 70% of Israelis for two-state solution, and there is 70% of the Palestinian for two-state solution. They're both ready for peace. That was in 1993 until 2000, and even beyond that. 80% of the Israeli public supported the war in Gaza. And overwhelming 90% of the Palestinian sympathized with Hamas resistance and Hamas action during the war in Gaza. So the communities polarized immediately. What do you do as a religious peacemaker when you see your community total or massively behind a leader who's manipulating their religious identity? Palestinians and Arab people demanded an end to the attack. That's from the outside. This is from Israel. This is how, this was picture actually picked up from the internet as well, where some teacher found it interesting to post it as well, to say how you sign as a kid a rocket going into Gaza. And also Palestinian kids growing up with the rifle. And I'm putting those two pictures, and a picture also of Palestinian kid with a rifle as well, because that's the reality where they live. And you look at it, and you look at this reality where children have been raised, in many cases, to accept the violence, even brainwashed to say violence is necessary for our survival, and also in a reality of ignorance to the extent that religious education for peace is not integrated, neither in Palestine nor in Israel. In fact, this is not only there. In many places, we keep our children away from the religion of the other until they are adults, and then we say, maybe now they're ready to hear about the other religion. We rarely teach our children about the other faith. We protect them very, very hard or very strictly in order not to confuse them, as I was told by several people we interviewed when I asked, why don't you have education for peace for children from a religious perspective? No, they will not understand it and it will confuse their religious identity. Basically, I was saying, let's indoctrinate them for the next 16 years, and then after that, they'll be ready to counterattack. Rejection of most peace and encounter program, that these are some of the reactions during the Gaza war. Palestinian-Israeli interfaith dialogue, several of them collapsed, and also the general public refused to have continuation of this encounter program. There was further demonization of the other, and there is the notion of shared living also was reduced in many of these groups. Basically, they've been traumatized. I looked at about 8 or 9 of these organizations inside Israel and also in the Palestinian area. The IIE, Interfaith Encounter, Israel Interreligious, Women in Jerusalem, Liqa, Sulha, Rabbis for Human Rights, and Jews Against Zionism as also another organization that was doing some work there. Here is 2 examples from religious peace builder during the interfaith dialogue. One of them said, dreaming for peace during war, but blaming the one side. This is a religious leader who during the war could not separate himself or herself from their nationalistic identity. So he's feeling pain for the death, but he's also accusing one side, not able to see or to work even with the other side. My prayer is that the madness of servants, the madness of the dreaming for a better world, the madness of seeing life as it should be, will prevail over madness of Hamas, which seem irrationally bent on self-destruction. So the whole problem of Gaza war is Hamas. Religious peace group on both sides were in a crisis. They both felt crisis, but acted differently. Majority of the Israeli religious peace activists and the group either were silent or endorsed the war. Few attended a protest and protested the Arab groups. Few Jewish rabbis spoke against the war after a week, written some article in Rabbis for Human Rights website. Eric Asherman, who worked with the Rabbi for Human Rights, said something very insightful, I think a week or 2 into the war. During the first week or so, the cast led, we were told that IDF was not harming citizens. It is perhaps a credit to Israelis that this is what they wanted to believe. And you can see that he at the end says, we have no choice. But this is one of the activists actually who adopted the confrontation, who get out of his comfort zone and engage in nonviolence resistance. Also some other Israelis demonstrating in Tel Aviv. On the Arab side, what you have is really no interreligious dialogue. Some kept silence. They shunned away any relationship with the Israeli. And the majority of them work on solidarity with the victims. They provided medical, they attended a protest group, and they reached for the International Organization for Solidarity. Basically, they disconnected from their counterpart. There are many obstacles for interreligious dialogue in this context, but the last one I want to point it out, the separation between dialogue, interfaith, religion and peace, and nonviolence resistance and advocacy. There is a gap between the two. And as long as this gap exists, then we end up with a very limited number of religious peace activists who basically operate within very limited circles, and their impact cannot be felt or measured in the other area. So here is the answer to this question that I could come up with. It's really a life journey, investment, and process. But for those who would like immediate results, you maybe want to pray for a miracle. But miracle is not going to come for a long term. It will come maybe for short term. Thank you for your patience and listening.
We do have maybe 10 to 15 minutes for questions. There are a couple of microphones coming around, so if you could raise your hand, and someone will come and help. Maybe calling people. Okay.
Namaste. Thank you for a very interesting talk. In the interest of dialogue as opposed to harmony, you noted that you consider Israel's tactics as an apartheid mechanism. Is it not also equally important to note that Hamas's charter could be considered, and really should be considered, genocidal?
Should we take one? Yeah. So we'll take one question, right? Okay. Again, I am not in the game of balance. Every point you make here, you have to make a point here equally and measure them. And in my talk, I hope I conveyed the message very clearly that this was not a praise of Hamas or the Palestinian or a denunciation of Israeli public or institution. I was talking about structure of occupation that resembles to the apartheid system. On the Palestinian side, there are lots of activities and actions and the groups who operate to defend themselves, and some, in the way to defend themselves, have denied the existence of the other. And I think when Hamas, the charter, the so-called charter, described, because if I was in your place, I wouldn't point the charter, I would point the suicide bombing, because I think the suicide bombing is a better example to articulate the point you want to make. The charter is a piece of paper that's there as part of the denial of the other. You still have several charters in Israel do not recognize the Palestinian, not only as a people, as a land, as owners, as indigenous who were there. So they both have a problem in recognizing and denying the other. Both the groups and certain groups in the two sides. And Hamas is not different from that aspect. But not recognizing is different than an apartheid system on the ground. Apartheid system on the ground is one that reduces mobility, reduces your humanity to a number. I don't need to explain it. I think you can just go to the internet and Google apartheid Palestine and you'll see lots of examples. The reality on the ground with 450 checkpoints is very different from a reality or a piece of paper that called for the full land of Palestine historically. Not that I endorse that, but I say let's not put it on the same scale. These are two different measures. And I was talking about the one with the apartheid system, with the measures of occupation and denying the basic human rights of Palestinians. It doesn't mean the charter is right or the suicide bombing is right.
I really enjoyed your talk and your analysis about dialogue with religion. I would like to ask, though, one thing that's becoming quite popular, at least to be discussed in the United States, is the idea of being spiritual but not religious, and that spirituality leading to a place of peacemaking or accommodation. Do you see that as being just something that's happening in the United States, or are you aware of it being more of a phenomenon, global phenomenon?
Thank you. Interesting question. I do, in the interfaith dialogue groups that I've worked in here in the US, there is more prevalence and presence of the individualistic path for spirituality. But again, there's also still the institution of Catholicism or Protestant church or Islam or Judaism still very strong in that sense and present. But you can find maybe out of 20, 4 individuals, usually 4 or 5, who will raise their hand and say, I have a unique individualistic path to spirituality. In conflict zone area, mostly Israel-Palestine where I work, or in Niger, Chad these days, the reality of religious institution is very different, and the boundaries are very set, and the structure of how do you access your spirituality is really pretty set in the institution, and not many people have had the choice and the chance to break away or challenge the existing institution. There are some, but again, those are in most cases persecuted for lack of fitting into the institution of religion in the conflict area. That's how it is. So I'm not sure it's a global. I think it's a global in certain areas.
Well, thank you for the presentation. I think you did a great job by how you used pictures and the word apartheid and the selective quotes to demonize one side. But having gone to Hebrew University, I know there's a very strong interfaith movement within Israel, in Jerusalem, in Akko, in Haifa, that does a lot of work to help the different communities. If it's in Egypt, between the Armenians and the Christians and the Copts and the Ethiopian Christians. Can you talk more about, I understand your political viewpoint, but I know you also have researched a lot. Can you talk more about how interfaith has worked in Israel, and if not Israel, how it's worked in South Africa, how it's worked in Ireland? Because we do know that there is power from our own civil rights movement for faith leaders to bring good, and you've pretty much depressed me on the use of interfaith. So why don't you help me cheer me up a bit, if you can?
Yeah, after all, we're in the US, you need to be cheered. My intention really was not to, I don't need to apologize for that, but my intention was to be critical, at the same time appreciative on the difficulty of operating in a system of conflict where the religious identities are so trapped. And on that level, it's very challenging to be a religious leader in Israel or Palestine and take a clear stand to confront the system. On issues of charity, social services, relationship building on a grassroots level, there are plenty of examples of that. But again, those examples can happen also without the conflict. So I have this friend who's a Catholic priest, Jesuit priest, who have spent his life for the last, since 1981 when I met him, in serving the Ethiopian, all the Christian children of immigrants who came to Israel and they find no place for them in the school system or in the social service system, and he has devoted his life to help them. I have many examples of individuals who spend their life so far connecting with the other side on a personal level and helping during a crisis and doing some work or some help for individuals. There are plenty of these examples. But again, my reference to it is from a peace-building component where you look at peace processes as macro, you look at social movement as massive movement. And this is not only in Israel-Palestine. In Egypt, it took a revolution on January 25th for Al-Azhar clergy to go into Tahrir Square. Before that, they could say, we are very active in the social services. We're very active in building relationship between Muslim and the Christian. But they were apolitical. Only about 40 of them, when they went to Tahrir Square as Azharite. And they stood and delivered the Friday khutbah. The institution where they came from took a significant step and recognition in that aspect. That's what I was talking about. I was talking about the institution of religion in Israel-Palestine, whether the rabbi for the Mizrahi or for the Ashkenazi, to stand for peace. Where the imam, head of Al-Aqsa, stand against the occupation and for dialogue. That type of stance is not there. They talk. They talk the talk. All the leaders. But to pay the price of facing, engaging in the social movement, in the nonviolent resistance, it's a different story. And again, I'm talking with we're not in any position to judge somebody what they should do, but from a critical academic privileged position, one can say that. I have to be there.
You talked about the importance of interfaith dialogue and the importance of religion in peace building. That was the good part of the substance of your talk. And yet, when you applied those ideas to your test case, the Gaza war, seemed like religion fizzled out. It turned out to be quite useless. Both sides sort of backed off. So given that it seems, why is it that we have to be focused on that, or rather fixated on that so much when it cannot deliver the goods, when we really need it at a critical time? You barely mentioned the United States at the very beginning, then you didn't get into it. Why not maybe international coalition led by the United States, which you endorse the idea that the United States really holds that magic wand. And America had been silent and inactive for quite a long time. How could the United States be brought into it, on what terms, to make an effective change? Because in the last Gaza conflict we saw, the moment Hillary Clinton came in, sent by President Obama from Indonesia, things changed right there. So could you talk a bit more about that, maybe?
Sure. Again, the example, the purpose was not to say it does not work. The purpose was to say it's difficult, challenging, and when the war comes, if you did good interfaith dialogue, build bridges, it should be sustained, and withstand the attack. Some did, but those who did were the one who engaged in the liberation model, not the one who were involved in the harmony model. That was what I was trying to say, because they were already taking a stand on that issue. On the issue of U.S. foreign policy, that's a painful topic, but the president is going there next week, finally. I think next week, or is he there? I think next week, the president taking his first trip to go to Israel and Palestine. And I hope he will actually, this administration will be more active, more assertive, and more hands-on in dealing with Israel-Palestine, because it's clear since 2000 until 2013, it's enough time to prove the point that they need help from outside, particularly the U.S., who have leverage over Israel as well, and also over the Palestinian. And also because we're in the last stage of Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen is about to exit, and the transition is not clear, and I'm not sure if we're going to get better than Mahmoud Abbas to negotiate with the Israeli. No one is really know what the replacement come. And also because on the reality on the ground, barely two-state solution possible. Barely, really, lots of sacrifice on the Israeli side and Palestinian side in order to reach two-state solution. And maybe I was shocked about 2 years ago, I took a delegation in Palestine, and I was really shocked to see the level of difficulty of having two-state solution. So the U.S. have lots of issues in dealing with them and intervening, and I hope this administration will do a little bit of what they promised in the beginning. Can we just have one woman question?
It will be me then. I really like the distinction between your two models, the harmony model and the liberation model. And one thing that I would like you to say a little bit, talk a little bit about is I don't see many interfaith group in the US working on the liberation model. And we are in an environment that is rather peaceful and positive. And then we hold groups, interfaith groups in conflict zone to a higher standard, saying like, oh, they should be working, much more efficiently and be on the liberation model. And so I want you to say a little bit more about your experience here in the U.S. or other Western countries, and how it could become like if we can practice the liberation model here. And enter in dialogue with other groups in conflict zones so that it builds a more global conversation on that model of liberation?
Well, also, the 2 points quickly here. One is that I'm not arguing for one or the other. I'm saying the two of them are connected, and we should not split them. We should have harmony. We should also not be afraid to move into the liberation model. But here in the U.S., it's amazing because it's the sort of hub of liberation theology in the Christian church, in the civil rights movement for at least 2 decades, and then after that, the whole movement was sort of homegrown, and that's what inspired many people in other places. And recently with the Wall Street movement, at least in the DC branch, there were 3-4 organizations from a faith base, from the church, who joined the movement and the strikes and the sit-in DC. There are examples. The CPT is one example, Quakers, some Mennonite I have worked with, but again, most of their work is on race relation and has to do with combination of stereotype reduction and prejudice reduction with some social services advocacy. The Quaker, the Mennonites, I've seen some work on that. Some Catholic Jesuit groups in the Rochester, New York, and also in DC area. I have been in touch in a very simple way, have adopted some of these confrontational, action-oriented resistance. But you're right, many times we expect from the outside to engage in these type of models, these type of activities, and in our backyard there is plenty of work from the interfaith dialogue groups. But again, I don't envy it, because here in the US, if you're an interfaith dialoguer, you're expected not to bring your religion to the public. But if you're in Israel-Palestine, you're quite the opposite. You're expected to bring your religion for different purpose into the public. So, the context here for a religious person is also more challenging in that sense, to bring politics and religion.
Thank you. Thanks very much for those provocative questions. We'll have more opportunity to talk outside and a little bit of food and some information about tomorrow's conference and some other activities coming up. So I hope you'll join us, and please join me in thanking Professor Abu-Nimer. Thank you.